Good day, ECO231 students. It is week 2 and we will begin with chapter 3, Consumer Behavior. The following topics covered include consumer preferences, budget constraints, consumer choice, revealed preference, and marginal utility and consumer choice. We omit section 3.6. It is not covered in second year micro. Week 2 will cover the first two topics, namely consumer preferences and budget constraints. Why is it important to understand consumer behavior? Any producer needs to understand the consumer preferences in order to determine the demand for their product and what price to charge to ensure profitability. Understanding consumer behavior theory can help explain how consumers allocate their incomes to the purchase of different goods and services, given their prices, and in turn determines the demand for various goods and services. Understanding purchasing decisions will help us understand how changes in income and prices affect demand for goods and services. The theory of consumer behavior can be described as how consumers allocate incomes among different goods and services to maximize their well-being. There are three distinct steps. These are consumer preferences, budget constraints, and consumer choices. We will begin with consumer preferences and budget constraints. Consumer preferences help us find a practical way to describe reasons people may prefer one good to another. It can be described both graphically and algebraically. Budget constraints. Consumers have limited incomes and must consider prices which will inevitably limit the quantities that can be bought. And lastly, consumer choices. So given the preferences and income constraints, consumers will choose a combination that will maximize their satisfaction. So what do consumers do? Our model makes some simplifying assumptions to explain consumer behavior. We have to ask are these realistic? While we can agree that consumers have preferences, they do face budget constraints and have to consider the prices of goods and services. But are we always rational and informed? Sometimes we purchase things impulsively, ignoring our budgets and going into debt. Sometimes we cannot decide on something and base our decisions on friends or what our neighbors may do. We do not always know all the prices of goods. Recent models in economics now incorporate more realistic assumptions regarding this, and it is a branch of economics called behavioral economics. Nonetheless, the model is extremely good in explaining what we actually see. To explain consumer preferences, let's consider how a consumer might compare different groups of items for purchase. A market basket or bundle is a list with specific quantities of one or more goods. Think about what a typical household may spend on each month. How do consumers decide what makes up that market basket? Table 3.1 presents a simple example of different market baskets consisting of total units of food and total units of clothing. Basket B, for instance, consists of 10 units of food and 50 units of clothing, whereas market basket E consists of 30 units of food and 40 units of clothing. To explain the theory of consumer behavior, we ask whether consumers prefer one basket to the next. We have some basic assumptions about preferences. The theory of consumer behavior has three basic assumptions. These assumptions tend to hold for most people. The first is completeness. Preferences are assumed to be complete, so we need to understand what does this mean. In other words, consumers can compare and rank all possible baskets. Thus, for any two market baskets, A and B, a consumer could prefer A to B or could prefer B to A, or the consumer could be completely indifferent between the two. So what does indifference mean? By indifferent, we mean that a person will be equally satisfied with either basket. That means you wouldn't mind whether you had basket A or basket B. It is important to note that these preferences ignore cost. I might prefer a steak to a hamburger, but I may buy the hamburger because it is cheaper. So take note that when we look at our assumptions regarding completeness, we are ignoring costs. The next assumption is transitivity. So what does transitivity mean? Well, preferences are transitive. Transitivity means that if a consumer prefers basket A to basket B and prefers basket B to basket C, then the consumer should, by virtue of that fact, also prefer basket A to basket C. Transitivity is normally regarded as necessary for consumer consistency. The final assumption is that more is always better than less. Goods are assumed to be desirable. By that we mean they are good. So consequently, consumers should always prefer to have more of any good than to have less. In addition, we assume that consumers are never satisfied or satiated. So more is always better than less, even if it is just a little bit more. So, of course, we know that not all goods are good. Some goods may be bad, for instance, air pollution. But we make the assumption that consumers would not purchase a bad. So for now, we will ignore these bads for our immediate discussion, but it will come up later. So remember the three assumptions, that is of completeness, transitivity, and more is better than less. It is possible to show consumer preferences graphically. We use indifference curves to do so. Now, an indifference curve is a curve that shows all combinations of market baskets that provide the consumer with the same level of satisfaction, i.e., you wouldn't mind either basket. So we will use our assumptions to rank consumption choices. Remember the table 3.1 with the simple example of two goods, namely food and clothing. The different market baskets are now represented on this figure. Those were the different combinations of food and clothing. So figure 3.1 shows these baskets graphically. On the horizontal axis, you can see that we have total units of food per week, and on the vertical axis, we have clothing units per week. So these are the various market basket bundles of food and clothing that were given in table 3.1. So because we know that more of each good is preferred to less, we are able to compare these market baskets, in particular in the shaded area. We can see that basket A is a combination of 30 units of clothing and 20 units of food, and it is clearly preferred to basket G, which is only 20 units of clothing and 10 units of food. However, we can see that basket E is preferred to both A and G. If we compare basket E to A, we can see that basket E is 40 units of clothing per week and 30 units of food. Hence, E is clearly preferred to A. However, we cannot compare A, with H, B, and D. We cannot clearly see that one is preferred to the other without additional information. So just to recap, an indifference curve is a curve that represents all combinations of market baskets that will provide a consumer with the same level of satisfaction. Let's evaluate in the next slide. So here we have an indifference curve. In order to evaluate or make some form of comparison, we needed more information. This additional information is given by figure 3.2, an indifference curve. And this indifference curve is labeled U1. We can see that it passes through points A, B, and D. So this indifference curve, U1, that passes through market basket A, shows all baskets that give the consumer the same level of satisfaction, as does market basket A. And these include B and D. So we can see that although these are different combinations of clothing and food, 50 units of clothing and 10 units of food, basket A is 30 units of clothing and 20 units of food, and basket D is 20 units of clothing and 40 units of food. They all lie on the same indifference curve. And that term indifferent means the consumer is indifferent between any one of those combinations of market baskets lying on the same indifference curve, U1. Note that the curve slopes downward from left to right. If it sloped upward from, let's say, A to E, it would violate the assumption that more is preferred to less. We can see that basket E has more food and clothing to A, so it must be preferred to basket A. Anything above or to the right of U1 would be preferred to a market basket on U1. In figure 3.3, we have what is called an indifference map. This helps to describe a person's preferences for all combinations of food and clothing. An indifference map is a graph containing a set of indifference curves showing the market baskets among which a consumer is indifferent. Here you can see we have 3 indifference curves making up the indifference map. U3 is furthest from the origin, and it therefore generates the highest level of satisfaction. Then we have U2, which is second furthest from the origin, and then lastly U1. So the further away the indifference curve is from the origin, further above or to the right, it would be or generate a higher level of satisfaction. So therefore, any market basket on indifference curve U3, such as market basket A, would be preferred to any market basket on U2, such as B, which in turn would be preferred to any market basket on U1, such as D. Figure 3.4 demonstrates that indifference curves cannot intersect. By doing so, the assumptions are violated. U1 and U2 are 2 indifference curves which intersect at point A. On U1, we have A and B, so the consumer would be indifferent between these 2 baskets. On U2, we have A and D, so the consumer is indifferent between those 2. Because of the assumption of transitivity, the consumer must be indifferent between B and D, but it cannot be so as B is preferred to D. It has more food and clothing, so hence it violates the assumption of more is better than less. We can see that B should be preferred to D as it has more of both.